Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing the right to protest, including the right to protest vile things. As I'm sure you've seen, there was a brutal and appalling terrorist attack by Hamas against Israeli civilians that included some of the worst crimes one can imagine. It targeted children, mothers, babies, grandmothers. There are innocent people who've been taken hostage into Gaza, which is now being bombed by Israel in response. And I have not been able to get the images of these crimes out of my head. I have Jewish family, and one thing that has disturbed me so deeply is to see the day following the attack, people walking among us, fellow Canadians, who celebrated the murder of these innocent people, of babies, of kids at concerts. These fellow Canadians, had I been in Israel, would have celebrated the murder of my family. Whatever your views on Palestinian statehood, this is not resistance. I went to the rally for Israel the day following this massacre. And on my way there, I saw people who had come for a rally for Palestine, people who were celebrating the day following the massacre, the terrorist organization Hamas, people who wanted to march in approval of the massacre. What should we think of people who would march to celebrate the rape, murder, and kidnapping of children, of atrocities against babies? When we talk about the right to freedom of expression, does it include the right to protest and express vile things? What is the limit? Here today to discuss this are two legal experts, my colleague Josh DeHaas of the Canadian Constitution Foundation and lawyer and friend of the show, Ryan O'Connor. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Josh, off the bat, let's get your reaction. These protests, and I'm not conflating current protests. I'm talking about protests in the immediate wake of the terrorist attack. I'm not conflating it with statehood protests, but these protests immediately following the attack, in my opinion, they are vile. What is your view on what the limit on protests and expression is in Canada?
Well, first off, Christine, I do agree with you that a lot of these protests were really disturbing to see. A lot of people were there saying they're there to support Palestinian statehood or Palestinian civilians, but a lot of people were also chanting things that are, arguably pro-genocide. And so I was pretty disturbed to see those too. In terms of the limits, in Canada, we have protection for freedom of expression under 2B of the Charter. And we have protection for freedom of assembly under Section 2C. And those apply to everyone. They apply to all Canadians, even Canadians that we consider vile or disgusting or that we think are supporting something that is unsupportable. And when it comes to free expression, we know that that's a content neutral protection. So while there are some limits on freedom of expression, all speech, regardless of content, is at least in an initial sense protected. And when it comes to freedom of peaceful assembly, we don't have a huge amount of case law on that, but it's pretty clear that it protects political speech and, getting together in a crowd to protest or to make a political point, regardless of whether it's something that most people would find offensive.
Ryan, your view both on the protests and the immediate aftermath of the massacre of Israeli civilians and your view on the limits.
Well, thanks again for having me, Christine. And before I start, I just wanted to express my condolences to your viewers who may have a familial or other connections to Israel. What we saw 2 weeks ago was nothing short of a tragedy. And it was nothing short of the worst anti-Semitic pogroms we've seen since the Holocaust and since the Second World War. To see individuals in our communities in Canada and Toronto, Mississauga, and throughout the country in the immediate aftermath celebrating it is nothing short of atrocious. They didn't even wait 24 hours to start discussing the geopolitical issues associated with Israel and the Palestinian territories. I found that many of the chants we've seen at those protests immediate aftermath were disgusting, were anti-Semitic, and frankly have no place in our vocabulary and public discourse. But just because I don't agree with what those individuals were chanting, if they were doing so peacefully,
they still have a right to say it.
They still have a right to say it.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.